The Grand Rotunda was the largest room ever built by any living species. It floated in orbit above a gray world called Aethys Prime, and inside it, 1,000 delegates from 100 civilizations sat in curved rows that rose like the inside of a bowl. The elder species sat at the top, in wide seats made of dark stone. The younger species sat below them. And at the very bottom, standing on a podium that had been built lower than every other seat in the room on purpose, stood Ambassador Han Dohan of Earth. He was a tall man in his late 50s. His hair was gray at the sides. His suit was plain and dark. He had the kind of face that rarely showed emotion, not because he did not feel things, but because he had spent 30 years learning when to show them and when not to. Today, he showed nothing at all. He was giving Earth's annual contribution report. It was something humanity had to do every cycle, like a student showing homework to a teacher who didn't care. He spoke clearly and calmly into the silence. He told them that Earth's humanitarian fleet had responded to 14 natural disasters across 8 different star systems in the past year. He told them that human medical teams had helped 3 developing species fight diseases that were killing their children. He told them that Earth's science ships had mapped unstable warp corridors in the outer sectors, corridors that had been destroying Vidara cargo ships for decades, and that the data had been shared freely. He told them all of this, and the assembly noted it the way someone notes the sound of rain outside a window. It was there. It did not matter. Dohan finished his report, bowed slightly, and waited. This was the part where the elder species could respond. High Speaker Olenth rose from his seat at the very top of the rotunda. He was the leading voice of the Vidara hegemony, a coalition of 6 ancient species who had controlled galactic politics for longer than Earth had known fire. Olenth was tall and thin, with skin the color of wet chalk and 4 eyes that never seemed to blink at the same time. He moved slowly, the way powerful beings moved when they wanted everyone to watch. He did not speak to Dohan. He turned to the gallery instead, as if the human ambassador was not worth facing directly. Every cycle, Olenth began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber, the humans come here and read us their little list. They tell us how many bandages they handed out, how many rocks they mapped, how many times they flew their tiny ships into someone else's disaster and waved their tiny hands. He paused. Laughter rolled through the upper rows. It is charming, truly, the way a pet is charming when it brings you something it found in the dirt. Dohan did not move. He talked about Earth's military, calling it a collection of patrol boats that would not survive a single afternoon against any proper fleet. He talked about humanity's emotional instability, their tendency to cry and shout and hug each other in public. He suggested, with a smile that showed too many teeth, that Earth's integration term should be extended by another 100 years, because they had clearly not yet developed the emotional maturity needed to sit among civilized species. More laughter. Some of the mid-tier species in the middle rows did not laugh. They looked down at their hands or their screens, but they said nothing. Then Olenth did something that changed everything. He raised one long hand, and a hollow screen appeared in the center of the rotunda. On it was a video clip, taken from Earth's own humanitarian broadcast feed. It showed a human child, no more than 5 years old, crying during an evacuation on one of the disaster worlds Earth had helped. The child was covered in dust, reaching for someone off-screen, tears running down her face. It was a moment of real pain, real fear, real humanity. Olenth narrated over it like it was a comedy. This, he said, gesturing at the crying child, is the species that believes it deserves a seat among the stars. Look at it. It cannot even control its own face. The rotunda erupted. Laughter filled the chamber from top to bottom. Delegates pointed at the screen. Some shook their heads in amusement. A few of the elder species clapped their hands together in the Vidara way, a sharp cracking sound that meant approval. On the observation level above the gallery, a young woman named Kwan Suha sat perfectly still. She was an intelligence officer, embedded in the diplomatic quarter under cover as a cultural attaché. She had spent 3 years on this station, watching and listening and sending quiet reports back to Earth. She had seen the Assembly be cruel before. She had seen them ignore humanity, dismiss humanity, talk over humanity. But she had never seen them laugh at a child. Her hand moved to her compad under the table. She began typing. Below on the podium, Do-hun stood in the silence that followed the laughter. He did not shout. He did not protest. He did not point his finger, or raise his voice, or make a speech about dignity. He had spent his whole career believing that patience and service would eventually earn respect. That if Earth just kept giving, kept helping, kept showing its best self, the galaxy would eventually see them as equals. He looked up at Olinth. He looked at the screen, where the image of the crying child still hung in the air. And something behind his eyes changed. It was not anger. It was something quieter than anger, and far more dangerous. It was the end of belief. He tapped his compad once. A single encrypted pulse went out to Earth, carrying 3 words in military shorthand that had not been used in 47 years. Then he looked at the Assembly one last time and said in a voice so calm it made the nearest delegates uncomfortable, "Received and understood." He turned and walked out. No farewell, no procedure, no protest. He simply left the chamber, his footsteps echoing in a room that had gone strangely quiet. On the observation level, Suha finished her encrypted message and sent it. It reached Earth 7 minutes later. It read, "The ambassador has walked. It's happening." In Geneva, it was almost 4 in the morning. Secretary General Cha Tae-gun sat alone in his office, watching the live feed from the rotunda. He had seen all of it. The report, the mockery, the child on the screen, the laughter. He had watched Do-hun walk out, and he had felt something crack inside his chest that he knew would never heal. On his desk sat a single document. It was called the Emergency Sovereignty Decree. It had been written 11 years ago and updated every 6 months since then, waiting in a locked drawer for the day it would be needed. Tae-gun picked up his pen. His hand was steady. He signed it. By the time the sun rose over Geneva, every treaty Earth had ever signed with the Galactic Assembly had been erased. 47 years of patience, of service, of quiet obedience, gone before breakfast. And the galaxy did not even notice. 3 days passed and the galaxy said nothing. No message came from the Assembly. No diplomatic inquiry. No angry transmission demanding an explanation. Earth had walked out of the most powerful institution in known space and nullified every agreement it had ever signed. And the Vidara hegemony treated it the way a man treats a dog that runs away from the yard. They assumed it would come back when it got hungry. Kwan Suha, still stationed on the Assembly's orbital platform under her cover identity, sent her daily report to Earth's Intelligence Command. It was short. "They are not watching us. They are not even curious. They think we are nothing." She paused before adding one final line. "Good." On Earth, the world had changed overnight, but quietly. There were no announcements on the public feeds, no speeches from government officials. The civilian population knew only that diplomatic relations with the Assembly had been suspended for review. But deep inside the military and intelligence networks that ran beneath every government on the planet, a single phrase was moving through encrypted channels like a pulse through a nerve. Black Veil is open. The Black Veil program was the most classified project in human history. It had no public record. It had no official budget line. The people who worked inside it did not exist on any government database. For 47 years, while Earth smiled at the Assembly and followed every rule and signed every treaty, and kept its military small and its weapons weak and its tone polite, the Black Veil program had been building something else entirely. Not out of hatred, not out of ambition, out of the simple, cold understanding that a species surrounded by older and stronger civilizations who treated it like dirt could not afford to actually be weak. It could only afford to look weak. Director Bei Jinu walked through the main corridor of the Pacific installation for the first time without a redacted clearance badge clipped to his chest. The installation was buried beneath the ocean floor, 3 kilometers under the Pacific, inside a hollowed-out geological formation that did not appear on any map. Jinu was a thin man with round glasses and hands that were always slightly ink-stained from writing notes on paper, a habit he refused to give up, even in an age of holographic displays. He had spent 22 years of his life inside this place. He had designed things here that he hoped the universe would never see. Today, he was showing them to people who had not known they existed. A group of senior military officials followed him through the corridors in stunned silence as he explained what Earth had actually built, while the galaxy was not looking. The first revelation was the fleet. The integration accords had limited Earth's military to 600 light vessels, barely enough to patrol its own system. Earth had complied. Those 600 ships existed, properly registered, properly inspected. But behind them, hidden inside hollowed asteroids, abandoned moons, and deep space stations scattered across 40 star systems, Earth had built 4,200 warships. They were not patrol boats. They were heavy cruisers, carrier groups, and siege platforms, each one designed to exceed the assembly's restricted tonnage by a factor of 30. They had been built slowly, piece by piece, over decades, assembled by crews who lived in the dark and never told their families what they did. The second revelation was called Grim Tide. It was a network of satellites, thousands of them, hidden in the empty spaces between star systems along every major trade and military corridor in the galaxy. When activated, they could collapse faster than light travel corridors across entire sectors. Any fleet caught inside a Grim Tide zone would be trapped in normal space, unable to jump, unable to run, unable to call for help. Earth had been planting these satellites for 30 years, disguised as scientific survey probes. The third revelation was called Pale Light, and it was the one that made a 4-star general sit down on a cargo crate and put his head in his hands. Pale Light was a directed energy weapon that could fire through folded space. It did not need to see its target. It did not need to be in the same star system as its target. It could hit a ship in orbit around a planet 12 light-years away with a beam that traveled through a warp tunnel and arrived in less than a second. There was no defense against it because by the time you saw the light, you were already dead. The fourth revelation was the quietest and perhaps the most dangerous. Over the decades, through Earth's generous technology sharing programs, its humanitarian data networks, its free infrastructure support to developing worlds, humanity had carefully placed dormant AI nodes inside the assembly's own communication systems. Root could listen to every message the assembly sent. It could read every military order, every diplomatic cable, every private conversation between High Speaker Olaf and his admirals. Earth had been listening to everything for 20 years, and no one had ever noticed because no one had ever thought to check. Why would they? Earth was the species that cried in public. That evening, Fleet Admiral Yoon Nari stood in a sealed command room beneath the lunar dry docks and addressed Earth's combined military through an encrypted channel that reached every hidden ship, every silent station, every officer who had spent years training for a war they hoped would never come. Nari was a woman in her early 50s, with short black hair and a scar along her jaw that she had never explained to anyone. She had risen through the ranks, not because she was loud or charismatic, but because every single person who had ever served under her trusted her completely. She did not waste words. For 47 years, she said, we trained in the dark. We built in silence. We followed their rules with one hand and prepared for the day they would break their promises with the other. That day has come. Not because they attacked us, but because they showed us they never intended to let us stand as equals. Every captain, every crew, every officer listening to this, you trained for this. You gave up years of your lives in places no one will ever know about, doing work no one will ever thank you for. I see you. Earth sees you. The fleet is awake. The channel closed. Across the solar system and far beyond it, in dark places between stars where no sensor had ever looked, 4,000 warships began to power up. Their running lights stayed off. Their engines burned cold. They moved through the black like something that had been sleeping for a very long time and had just opened its eyes. In his quarters beneath the Pacific, Genu sat alone at his desk. The lights were low. His glasses reflected the glow of a single screen, showing the activation status of every weapon system he had ever designed. Green lights, one after another, climbing up the display like stars turning on. A colleague stopped at his door. "This is your life's work." Genu did not look up. "I designed these systems to be so terrifying that no one would ever force us to use them," he said quietly. "If we have to fire them in anger, then I have failed. But if one demonstration is all it takes to make them understand, then perhaps the fear was the point all along." He took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly, the way he always did when he was thinking about something that weighed more than he could carry. Outside, in the silence of space, the fleet moved, and the galaxy still was not watching. 2 weeks after Ambassador Han Do-hun walked out of the Grand Rotunda, the first cracks appeared not on Earth, but in the places Earth used to protect for free. It started with the shipping lanes. For decades, Earth's humanitarian and patrol fleets had quietly maintained safety along dozens of trade corridors that the Assembly considered too remote or too unimportant to patrol themselves. Earth had done this without being asked, without being paid, and without ever receiving credit for it. The routes simply worked because human ships were there, watching, responding, clearing debris, chasing off pirates, and keeping the lights on for species that never even knew who was keeping them safe. Now the lights were off. Earth's ships had pulled back to their own territory. The corridors went dark. Within 10 days, 2 Vidara cargo convoys were lost to pirate attacks in a sector that had been safe for 30 years. A medical transport from a mid-tier species called the Dulcian was seized and stripped in open space. Its crew left drifting in escape pods for 6 hours before anyone responded. Emergency distress calls went unanswered because the ships that used to answer them were gone. In the Assembly, High Speaker Olens was told about the convoy losses during a private briefing. He waved his hand dismissively. "They will come back," he said. "Their economy depends on Assembly trade. When their people start to feel hunger, they will crawl back to this chamber and beg to sign new accords. This is what young species do. They throw tantrums, and then they return." He was wrong, but he would not know this for several more days. On the Assembly station, Kwon Suha moved carefully. She had been embedded here for 3 years, posing as a cultural attaché, and her cover was still intact. No one suspected her because no one suspected Earth of being capable of espionage. She used this invisibility, the way a knife uses stillness, not moving until the exact right moment. She arranged a quiet meeting with 3 delegates from the Riven Compact, the loose alliance of mid-tier species who sat in the middle rows of the rotunda and rarely spoke. These were species who had watched the Vidara mock Earth for years and had said nothing, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. Suha understood fear. She also understood how to turn it into something more useful. She did not give them military secrets. She did not offer weapons or alliances. She gave them a simple economic report, compiled by Earth's analysts, showing exactly how much of the Assembly's logistical backbone had been maintained by humanity's unpaid work. The numbers were devastating. Earth had been subsidizing trade route safety disaster response, medical aid, and infrastructure maintenance across 46 systems. The annual value of this free labor, calculated in assembly standard credits, was larger than the combined military budgets of the 3 Riven compact species sitting across from her. She let them read it in silence. Then she said, "We are not asking for anything. We just thought you should know what you are about to lose." She stood, nodded politely, and left. The 3 delegates sat in that room for a long time after she was gone, reading the numbers again and again. 4 days later, Earth made its first public move. A single Grimtide satellite activated near the Maven Corridor, one of the busiest faster-than-light travel routes in the galaxy. The effect was immediate. FTL travel through the corridor collapsed. Ships that were mid-jump were pulled out of warp space and dropped into the void, their navigation systems screaming warnings. Ships waiting to enter the corridor found their drives spinning uselessly against a wall of disrupted spacetime that had not been there an hour ago. For 11 hours, the Maven corridor was dead. Hundreds of ships were stranded. Trade stopped. Communications flooded with distress signals and demands for explanation. No one knew what had happened. No one had ever seen technology that could shut down faster-than-light travel across an entire sector. Then the satellite deactivated. The corridor reopened. Ships began moving again, and across every communication frequency in the galaxy, a single message was broadcast in Earth Standard language, simple and clear enough for any translation system to process. This was a calibration test. You have our attention now. The message was unsigned. It did not need a signature. Panic spread faster than the message itself. Within hours, the Assembly's communication channels were flooded with demands from a dozen species wanting to know what had happened. The Vidara's own military analysts ran the sensor data and could not explain how it was possible. They knew, in theory, that disrupting FTL corridors could be done, but the energy requirements were supposed to be beyond any single civilization. The idea that Earth, a species they had classified as a minor power with a patrol fleet, could do this was not frightening. It was impossible. And yet, the data was clear. High Speaker Olenth called an emergency session of the Assembly. He stood at his high seat and demanded immediate sanctions against Earth. He called for a full train blockade. He called for military posturing along Earth's borders. He called for a united response from every species in the chamber. The Vidara hegemony's 6 members moved as one, as they always did. Then something happened that had never happened before in the recorded history of the Galactic Assembly. The Riven Compact, 12 mid-tier species who had voted with the Vidara on every major resolution for centuries, formally abstained. Not opposed, not in favor. Abstained. They sat in their seats and said nothing. And their silence was louder than anything Olenth had ever heard. He stared at them. They did not meet his eyes. The resolution passed, but barely, and without the weight of a unified assembly behind it. The cracks that Suha had started were spreading. 3 days after the Mavan Corridor incident, Ambassador Dovun appeared again, but not in person. He did not return to the station. He did not stand on the lower podium. Instead, his image was broadcast via a direct holofeed into the center of the Grand Rotunda, projected at full size, standing at eye level with the elder seats for the first time in human history. He had not asked for permission to broadcast. He had simply done it, using channels that the Assembly's own security systems should have blocked, but did not, because Root had been inside those systems for 20 years. Dohun looked the same as he always did, calm, measured, gray at the temples. But there was something different in his eyes. The patience was gone. In its place was something that looked like clarity. "For 47 years," he said, "we gave you our ships, our medicine, our maps, and our patience. We answered every insult with service, We responded to every dismissal with another act of good faith. And you gave us a low chair and a long leash, and laughed when we tried to speak. The rotunda was completely silent. We are not here to renegotiate. The integration accords are dead. Earth does not answer to this body. We are not asking for a seat at your table. We do not want your table. He let that sit for a moment. If you wish to discuss terms, new terms, between equals, you know where to find us. But you will come to us. We will not come to you again. The feed cut to black. The rotunda stayed silent for a long time. That night, in a sealed chamber deep within the Vidara flagship, Olin sat with 6 of his senior military commanders. His face was the color of old paper. His 4 eyes blinked rapidly, a sign of stress that he could not control. They are bluffing, he said, though his voice did not sound sure. One satellite trick does not make them a power. We have 8,000 warships. They have 600 patrol boats. We will remind them what they are. They began planning a strike on Earth's outer colonies. A corrective action, they called it. A demonstration of real power meant to put humanity back in its place. They were confident. They had the numbers, they had the experience. They had won wars that lasted longer than humanity's entire space age. What they did not have, and what they could not have known, was that every word spoken in that sealed chamber was being recorded by a root node embedded in the flagship's own communication array, and that a transcript was sitting on Fleet Admiral Yoon Nari's desk before Olinth had even finished speaking. Nari read it once. She read it again. Then she opened a channel to her fleet commanders and said 5 words. New Busan. They are coming. New Busan was not a military world. It was a farming colony on a green planet in a quiet system, 3 jumps from Earth's core territory. 1.2 million people lived there. They grew rice in flooded fields that stretched to the horizon under a sky that was a slightly deeper blue than Earth's. They mined rare minerals from the mountains in the southern continent. Their children went to school in small towns with names that reminded the first settlers of home. It was the kind of place that existed because humans could not help building homes wherever they went, even in the emptiness between stars. The colonial governor, a woman named Park Yuna, received the alert at 6 in the morning local time. A Vidara strike fleet had been detected entering the outer approach corridor. 600 warships, heavy cruisers, bombardment platforms, fighter carriers. It was not a patrol. It was not a diplomatic escort. It was a hammer, sent to crush a world of farmers and remind humanity what happened to species that forgot their place. Yuna's hands shook as she reached for the emergency communication console. She was a civilian administrator, not a soldier. She had never seen a warship in person. She began activating evacuation protocols, her mind already calculating how many transport ships she had, and how many people she could move, and how many would be left behind. Then a message arrived from Fleet Admiral Yoon Nari's command, transmitted on a channel so heavily encrypted that Yuna's system needed 4 seconds to decode it. The message was brief. Do not evacuate. Stay calm. We are already there. Yuna read it 3 times. She looked out her office window at the quiet fields, and the blue sky, and the children walking to school in the distance. She closed the evacuation program. And she waited. The Vidara strike fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of New Busan's star system at exactly 1400 hours Assembly Standard Time. They arrived in perfect formation, 600 warships arranged in the classic Vidara assault pattern that had not been defeated in 4,000 years of galactic warfare. Their admiral, a decorated veteran of 3 major campaigns, opened a channel to the planet below and delivered a prepared statement declaring that Earth's colony was in violation of assembly sanctions and would submit to immediate inspection and disarmament or face consequences. No one on the planet responded. The admiral waited. He repeated the message. Silence. Then the grim tide activated. Every FTL corridor leading out of the system collapsed simultaneously. The exit routes folded in on themselves like doors slamming shut. The Vidara fleet's navigation systems screamed alerts. Their warp drives, which had been on standby for a quick withdrawal if needed, spun uselessly against disrupted space. In an instant, 600 warships were locked inside the system with no way out. They could not jump, they could not run, they could not send an FTL distress signal to the hegemony. They were alone. The admiral kept his composure. He ordered his fleet into defensive formation and activated all sensor arrays to maximum range. If they were trapped, he wanted to see what had trapped them. He saw it. From the asteroid fields that drifted in the system's outer ring, from behind the moons of the gas giant in the fourth orbit, from the dark empty spaces between worlds where nothing should have been hiding, Earth's shadow fleet emerged. Not all of it, not even close, but 800 ships was more than enough. They decloaked in a perfect hemisphere around the Vidara force, appearing on sensors like stars switching on in a sky that had been empty a moment before. Heavy cruisers, siege platforms, carrier groups, each one running dark, weapons hot, crews at battle stations. They had been here for days, waiting in silence, knowing exactly when the Vidara would arrive and exactly where they would drop out of warp, because Root had sent them the enemy's own navigation plans. Nari's voice came through on an open channel, calm and clear, the way someone speaks when they have already won and they know it. You came to punish a colony of farmers. You will now hold position and listen. The Vidara admiral stared at his tactical display. They had surrounded his fleet so completely that there was no angle of attack, no formation shift, no maneuver in any textbook that could extract his ships without catastrophic losses. He had walked into a trap so perfect that it did not even look like a trap. It looked like an execution that had been paused out of courtesy. Then Nari ordered the demonstration. A single ship in the human formation, a vessel that the Vidara sensors classified as a mid-range cruiser, powered up a weapon system that the admiral's computers could not identify. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Vidara database. It built for 3 seconds, a rising hum that every ship in the system could detect on passive sensors. And then, it fired. The beam did not travel through normal space. It entered a fold in spacetime, a warp tunnel that the weapon itself created, and crossed the entire star system in less than a second. It struck an uninhabited dwarf planet on the far side of the system, a dead rock roughly the size of a small moon, and it broke it in half. The planet cracked along its equator like an egg. Pieces of it began to drift apart, glowing orange along the fracture lines, and the shock wave sent debris spiraling outward in a cloud that would take centuries to settle. The Vidara admiral's bridge went silent. Every officer stared at their screens. The weapon had fired from a ship that was behind the Vidara fleet. The beam had traveled through folded space. It had hit a target that the firing ship could not even see with direct sensors. The implications were clear to every military mind in that fleet. This weapon did not need line of sight. It did not need to be close. It could hit any ship, anywhere, from any direction, and there was nothing in Vidara technology that could stop it. The admiral opened a private channel to his fleet commanders. His voice was steady, but only barely. They can hit us from anywhere. We cannot even see where the shots come from. Advise. No one advised. There was nothing to advise. Then a second voice joined the channel. Ambassador Dohun, speaking from Earth, his tone as calm and measured as it had been the day he walked out of the rotunda. Admiral, your fleet is intact. Your crews are alive. We have destroyed nothing but an empty rock. We have no interest in slaughter. You were sent here by a man who mocked a crying child to win an argument. We are not like him. He paused. Power down your weapons, and you leave freely. All of you, every ship. You have 10 minutes. The admiral stood on his bridge and looked at the tactical display. 600 ships under his command. crews numbering in the hundreds of thousands, families waiting at home, careers and lives and futures, all sitting inside metal hulls that a single invisible beam could crack open like that dwarf planet. He thought about the orders Olenth had given him. He thought about honor and the long history of the Vidara military, and what it meant to surrender without firing a single shot. Then he thought about the crews, young officers on their first deployment, engineers in the lower decks who had signed up to serve, not to die for a politician's bruised pride. He thought about all of them, and he made the only choice that a good commander could make. He powered down his weapons. The signal went out to the entire fleet. One by one, 600 warships went dark. Shields dropped. Weapon systems cooled. The fleet sat motionless in the black, silent and surrendered. Nari watched from her command bridge. She gave a single order. Open Corridor 7. One squadron at a time. Let them go. The Grim Tide satellites deactivated along a single exit route. The Vidara ships began to leave, slowly, in small groups, passing between the human warships that hung in the dark like mountains. Not one shot was fired. Not one ship was damaged. Not one life was lost. It took 4 hours for the entire fleet to withdraw. When the last Vidara ship jumped out of the system, Nari sat down in her command chair and closed her eyes for a long moment. Her bridge crew watched her in silence. She opened her eyes and said, "Send a message to New Busan. Tell them their sky is clear." On the assembly station, Olenth stood in his private chamber and watched the sensor feed as his fleet retreated from a system it had entered expecting to deliver a punishment, and left having received a lesson. His hands were shaking. His 4 eyes blinked so rapidly that he could barely see. A Riven Compact delegate, one of the 3 who had met with Suha weeks ago, passed him in the corridor outside. The delegate stopped, looked at Olenth, and said quietly, "They could have destroyed your fleet. Every single ship. They chose not to." He shook his head slowly. "That is the most terrifying thing I have ever seen." Olenth said nothing. The delegate walked away, and for the first time in his long career, the High Speaker of the Vidara hegemony had no words left. 1 month after the confrontation at New Busan, the Galactic Assembly reconvened. The Grand Rotunda looked the same as it always had, the curved rows rising like the inside of a bowl, the elder species at the top, the younger ones below. But something was different, and every delegate who walked through the doors felt it before they could name it. The lower podium was gone. The platform where Earth's ambassador had stood for 47 years, the one that had been built deliberately below every other seat, so that humans would always have to look up when they spoke, had been physically removed. Its mounting bolts had been cut clean. The floor where it had stood was smooth and bare. Ambassador Han Do-hun had arranged for it to be disassembled and shipped to the Vidara hegemony's capital world in a sealed crate, labeled as a historical artifact for your archives. No further explanation was included. In its place, at the same level as every other delegation, sat Earth's new diplomatic station. It was simple. A curved desk, 4 chairs, a communication array, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to intimidate. Just a seat at the same height as everyone else. No one had voted to approve this change. No one had objected to it either. Do-hun sat at the center of the station. To his left sat Kwan Suha, no longer operating undercover, now formally titled as Earth's Senior Intelligence Liaison to the Assembly. She wore a dark suit and an expression that gave away nothing. She had spent 3 years pretending to be invisible. Now she sat in open view, and the delegates who passed her station felt a quiet unease, the kind that comes from realizing that someone who was watching you in secret is now watching you openly, and no longer needs to hide. The first order of business was not Earth. It was the Riven Compact. 12 mid-tier species, civilizations that had spent centuries voting in lockstep with the Vidara out of fear and habit, formally announced a joint request for bilateral treaties with Earth. Trade agreements, mutual defense arrangements, technology exchanges, scientific cooperation, all negotiated directly, outside the assembly framework, as agreements between equals. The announcement was read by a Dalshan delegate, whose voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what his species was doing. They were breaking away from the Vidara's gravity for the first time in their history, and they knew it. The elder species listened in silence. There was nothing they could do. The Assembly's own charter allowed bilateral agreements, and the Vidara no longer had the votes to change that charter without compact support. The balance of power that had held for millennia shifted in the time it took to read a single statement. Suha coordinated the agreements over the following weeks, working from a small office on the station that quickly became the busiest room on the platform. Species that had never spoken to each other directly began talking because Earth gave them a reason to. Trade routes that had been controlled by the Vidara for centuries were renegotiated. Medical technology that Earth had been forced to share exclusively through the Assembly was now offered freely to anyone who asked. The galaxy did not reorganize overnight, but it began to lean in a different direction, and everyone could feel it. Within the Vidara hegemony, the consequences arrived more privately, but no less severely. High Speaker Oland was removed from his position 3 weeks after the New Busan incident. He was not removed by Earth. He was not removed by the Assembly. He was removed by his own people. The 5 other elder species in the hegemony blamed him for provoking a confrontation that had exposed their military as outdated and their intelligence as blind. Decades of careful superiority had been undone because one man had chosen to mock a child on a screen and had mistaken cruelty for strength. Oland's replacement was a figure named Seville, a quieter and more careful leader who had opposed the strike on New Busan from the beginning, but had been overruled. Seville's first act was to send a private message to Secretary General Cha Tae-gun, requesting what he called informal dialogue between parties with mutual interests. The message was polite, carefully worded, and entirely free of the condescension that had defined Vidara communications with Earth for half a century. Tae-gun received the message. He read it. He set it aside. He responded 3 weeks later with a single line: "We are available to talk at your convenience." The delay was deliberate. 3 weeks was exactly how long the Assembly had once made Earth wait for a response to a humanitarian aid request during a crisis on one of its outer colonies. Tae-gun did not explain the timing. He did not need to. In the Pacific installation beneath Earth's ocean floor, Director Bae Jinu quietly began the process of placing the pale light weapon system into deep storage. The weapon that could fire through folded space and strike targets in other star systems, the most powerful things humanity had ever built, was powered down, sealed in shielded vaults, and locked behind authorization codes that required the agreement of 3 separate branches of government to access. Nari visited the installation the day before the vaults were sealed. She stood in the weapon bay and looked at the machinery that had cracked a planet in half with a single shot. "You are making a mistake," she told Jinu. "We should keep these active. Deterrence only works if the weapon is ready." Jinu shook his head. He cleaned his glasses the way he always did when he was thinking carefully. "The best weapons are the ones that only need to exist," he said. "Everyone saw what pale light can do. The memory of it is the deterrent now. If we ever have to fire these in anger at a ship full of living beings instead of an empty rock, then we have already failed at everything we were trying to do." Nari disagreed. She was a soldier, and soldiers understood that the universe was not as kind as engineers hoped it would be. But she respected Jinu's conviction, and she did not override his decision. The weapons went into storage. The vault sealed with a sound like a heavy door closing on a room no one wanted to enter again. 1 week later, Nari stood on the command bridge of the ESWS Docto, Earth's new flagship, a vessel that had been built in secret and had only recently been given a name. Through the forward viewport, the Shadow Fleet passed in full formation for the first time in open space. 4,000 warships, no longer hidden, no longer dark, flying in clean lines against the black, with their running lights on. Crews who had trained in silence for decades stood at their stations and looked out at the ships beside them, and saw for the first time how many of them there really were. Nari watched them pass. She did not smile. She did not speak. She stood with her hands behind her back and allowed herself one quiet moment where she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was not triumph. It was the exhausted relief of someone who had carried a weight for years and had finally been allowed to set it down. On the last day of the assembly session, Dohun rose to speak. The rotunda fell silent immediately. A month ago, delegates would have talked over him. Today, they stopped what they were doing and turned to face him the moment he stood. He looked tired. The lines on his face were deeper than they had been a month ago. His voice was steady, but there was no fire in it, no victory, no satisfaction. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has done something necessary and wishes it had not been. "We did not want this," he said. "I need you to understand that. We spent 47 years trying to earn your respect through service. We sent our ships to your disasters. We gave our medicine to your sick. We mapped your corridors and shared the data freely. We sat on that lower podium and we spoke politely, and we followed every rule you gave us, because we believed that if we just kept showing you who we were, you would eventually see us as equals." He paused. The silence was absolute. "You answered with contempt. You laughed at our service. You played a video of a frightened child and used it as entertainment. And when we stopped smiling, you sent a war fleet to punish a colony of farmers." He shook his head slowly. "So we showed you what we had been holding back. Not because we wanted to frighten you, but because you left us no other language you were willing to hear." He looked around the rotunda, at the elder species in their high seats, at the mid-tier delegates who had finally found their voices, at the younger species who were watching from the lower rows with wide eyes. "We are not your enemy," Dohan said. "We never were, but we will never again be your joke." He sat down. No one spoke. No one laughed. For the first time in 47 years, the grand rotunda of the Galactic Assembly was completely, perfectly silent. And in that silence, for the first time, they actually listened. 3 days later, Quan Suha filed her final intelligence summary from the station. It was a short document, dry and professional, the kind of report that would be archived and rarely read. But the last line, written not for the file, but for herself and for everyone who had worked in the shadows to bring Earth to this moment, said everything that mattered. Galactic perception of Earth has been reclassified across all major species databases. Previous designation, developing. Integration tier, probationary. Current designation, sovereign. Peer status, strategic concern. She paused, then typed the final words. "They finally see us. End report." She closed her terminal, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the observation window at the stars. Somewhere out there, 4,000 ships were flying in the light for the first time. Somewhere out there, a colony of rice farmers on a green planet were watching their children walk to school under a sky that was safe, because someone had fought for it without ever firing a shot. She allowed herself a small smile. Then she started packing for the trip home.